let's just dive right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and hugely popular speech by Allama Delwar Hossein Saidi. His core thesis is actually pretty bold. He's arguing that when Islamic scholars achieve absolute, unbreakable unity, massive geopolitical victories literally have to follow. It's this sweeping historical narrative, and we're going to break down exactly how he builds that argument and, what it tells us about how historical rhetoric shapes modern geopolitics.
To really get his argument, we're going to follow his geographic journey. So, our roadmap today. First, the core power of scholars' unity. Second, the anti-Soviet war in Afghanistan. Third, the Islamic Revolution in Iran and America. Fourth, political unity in Pakistan. And finally, the persecution of scholars in Bangladesh. All right, Section 1, the core power of scholars' unity. Let's look at the foundational formula he sets up right out of the gate. Saidi claims that from the anti-British movements all the way up to the October 1st elections in 2001, religious unity has been the one true catalyst for triumph. But to make us really appreciate this unity, he does something interesting. He paints a picture of absolute, almost absurd disunity. He talks about the landscape of four major conflicts, describing scholars who were so deeply divided they'd label their rivals as kafir or non-believers for totally arbitrary things, like 5, 3, or 17 different reasons. It got so wild, he says, that if a cow happened to eat grass from a rival faction's grave, they'd declare the cow a kafir too. I mean, they'd literally hide their faces with handkerchiefs in public just to avoid eye contact and flat out refuse to return basic Islamic greetings of peace. He uses this extreme polarization to show just how miraculous it was when they did finally unite.
Moving on to Section 2, the anti-Soviet war in Afghanistan. This is his very first major case study to prove his point.
So he frames the initial conflict as this impossibly asymmetric war. On one side, you've got the Soviet Union, a giant superpower armed to the teeth with massive, modern, highly destructive weaponry. And on the flip side, he compares the Afghan mujahideen to a newborn baby. He literally says they were fighting with ancient, waterlogged guns that looked like they belonged to the era of Noah's flood. He's setting up this classic David and Goliath scenario to really drive home that their eventual victory defied all conventional military logic.
Now, the turning point in his story is the specific chain of events. When the war against the Soviets broke out, people obviously had to run. And the rugged, mountainous, jungle terrain of Afghanistan meant that citizens, and crucially these deeply divided scholars, all ended up fleeing to the exact same remote hiding spots. The environment physically forced these bitter rivals, the guys who wouldn't even look at each other, right into close quarters. And in those jungles, they finally united. That specific catalyst, he argues, is what allowed them to sustain a grueling 9-year war and actually defeat a global superpower. And he uses this really humorous anecdote to capture the human side of all that chaos. He talks about how families were completely scattered. Sons went off to their uncles, wives to their fathers. But ironically, all the rival Sunni and Badadi scholars ended up bottlenecked in the exact same jungle camps. He points out that they finally embraced each other, realizing that if they had just united earlier, the Russian ghost, as he puts it, would never have been able to ride on their shoulders in the first place. But he drops a really crucial caveat here. It's basically a warning. Yes, the power of unity led to a victorious 9-year war and the establishment of an Islamic state, but it wasn't permanent. He argues that the second suspicion returned, the exact moment they stopped greeting each other again, the cost was immediate. That internal rift, he claims, led straight to their downfall, allowing the United States, and he specifically calls out President Bush here, to step in and take total control. So the takeaway is, unity is absolute power, but disunity means instantly losing your sovereignty. Okay, Section 3. Islamic Revolution in Iran and America. Let's look at his second international case study. What's really fascinating here is how Saidi completely separates theology from geopolitics. He's very upfront about his own theological differences, his Aqidah, with Iranian scholars. But he says, look, despite those differences in religious thought, he has massive respect for their geopolitical strategy. He argues that because the Iranian Ayatollahs maintained absolute, ironclad unity among themselves, they managed to establish an Islamic state and successfully humiliate an American superpower. It just shows how a shared political goal can completely override deep theological divides when it comes to raw power.
To back this up, he walks through a specific sequence during the Iranian hostage crisis. So, 56 Americans are detained at the U.S. Embassy. America responds with a massive ultimatum: release them or we cut off all food supplies and aid to Iran. It's a textbook geopolitical siege tactic. But Ayatollah Khomeini's response, at least how the speaker frames it, sets the stage for this incredible moment of defiance. Khomeini says, "Who are you threatening with food? A nation for whom fasting 1 month a year is obligatory doesn't wait for your food.
"We do not care about the food of kafirs like you." By using this exact quote, Saidi is showing how religious discipline, like the obligatory fasting during Ramadan, was literally weaponized as an impenetrable shield against an economic embargo. He's making the point that when a nation's religious leadership is fully united, even the threat of starvation by a global superpower is rendered completely useless.
Moving on to Section 4, Political Unity in Pakistan. Here he briefly points to the political landscape right next door. He highlights the formation of the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, or the MMA, in Pakistan. This organization somehow managed to bring together all classes of Islamic scholars from every single sect and school of thought. And the result? They completely surprised the entire world with a sweeping political victory. For Saidi, this is the ultimate modern proof of his thesis. These cross-sectarian alliances don't just win guerrilla wars in jungles, they actually translate into massive, legitimate earthly power at the ballot box.
And finally, Section 5, Persecution of Scholars in Bangladesh. This is where he brings his sweeping historical narrative right back home.
You can really feel the pivot here. He goes from these epic, global tales of miraculous victories to a very dark contrast regarding his own country's recent history. He argues that in Bangladesh, instead of tapping into the proven geopolitical power that comes from aligning with religious scholars, the previous government actively persecuted them. He claims the state basically treated these scholars not as assets for national strength, but as their absolute worst lifelong enemies.
To really drive this home, he brings up some highly charged examples of state-sponsored hostility. He talks about scholars being hunted and a systemic culture of extreme disrespect being allowed to flourish. And, perhaps most shockingly, he mentions a specific, deeply offensive incident where a poet was allowed to publish writing comparing the holy Fajr Azan, the early morning call to prayer, to a prostitute calling out to her customer. By laying out these intense examples, he's painting a picture of a nation actively at war with its own religious identity, which is the exact opposite of the victorious paths he just mapped out in Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we've seen how Saidi intricately weaves historical events, theology, and modern politics into one cohesive argument about unity, but it definitely leaves us with a really important question to chew on. How do political and religious figures rely on highly selective historical narratives to shape our modern perspectives on the relationship between state power and religious leadership? It really makes you think about how history and rhetoric are endlessly intertwined to influence listeners today. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me to unpack this fascinating geopolitical worldview. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.